Prior to the release of 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons in the year 2000, Dungeons & Dragons used different systems and different mechanics for different situations. They did not have a core unified mechanic. I'm going to talk about why that is, what some of those systems were, and why the shift was made to a core mechanic today on Daddy Roll a 1. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons. So if you were relatively new to the game of D&D and say you started in the year 2000 or after with one of the editions published by Wizards of the Coast, either 3rd or 3.5, 4, 5, whatever, you are probably used to a mechanic that is now commonly known as a core unified mechanic, and that is that you're using a d20 to solve pretty much every instance in the game that comes up. So you're using a d20, you're applying some type of modifier, and then you're comparing it to a target number. And that's going to work for combat and saving throws and skills and initiative and basically anything you can think of, class-based abilities, all work on that D20 unified mechanic. However, in the 26 years, so over 2.5 decades of time from 1974 through early 2000, there was no unified mechanic in Dungeons & Dragons in any of the editions, original, advanced, or the basic line. That's at least what we called it then, although this is technically just called Dungeons & Dragons. But there were different mechanics for different situations that came up in the game. Now, a lot of that was based on the idea that some of these dice that we use and take for granted now were at the time a little bit more difficult to get a hold of. And so some of the mechanics were based on using 6-sided dice because they were cheap and they were, again, readily available. And as time went on, mechanics started to be developed based around using some of these other types of dice. But it's not just a matter of dice, it's also a matter of game design and game design theory and philosophy. And so what I'm going to do in this video is talk about some of those different mechanics and really why they were designed that way. Mostly I'm going to be dealing with Gary Gygax as being sort of the person who really kind of promoted and pushed D&D. However, a lot of these things predate him. A lot of them come from Dave Arneson, his co-creator of Dungeons & Dragons. So I'm going to talk about that. It is a little bit difficult sometimes to kind of figure out like why exactly was a specific mechanic applied for a specific situation instead of a different mechanic. But we are going to go through that and try to figure that out. And so these are my original dice that came with the very first set of D&D I ever got, which is this one here. This is the Moldvay Basic box set, 1981. So I got this as an Easter gift in the spring of 82, but I started playing in late winter of 81. And so these are the dice that came in that box. And then they came with this white crayon here. I don't know which one of the white crayons because I have two of them in here. But and the idea was that you were supposed to color these numbers in so you could read them easier. I've talked a little bit about this before, and I just never did. I was a very anxious kid, and I was afraid that somehow I was going to ruin my dice if I colored them with the chalk or the crayon, and what if it didn't wipe off? And that's, silly now looking back on, but at the time it was a huge concern for mine. But these are similar to the dice that would have been used in the original game, although I believe they were tended to be multicolored, so each die had a different color first, so you could identify it very, very quickly. And then, of course, the 10-sided die would not have been part of that. So these are the platonic solids, so-called because every side is exactly equal to every other side in the shape, and they're like equally balanced. This one is not, because you can see the shapes are different for the sides. Okay, so a lot of people say, oh, well, the reason that there was no 10-sided die in the original group of dice is because the 10-sided die hadn't been developed yet. That's actually incorrect. So 10-sided die have been around longer than Dungeons & Dragons. They just weren't used originally because these original dice were sold in like math and teacher catalogs, like educational catalogs to be used for teaching mathematics. And so they were packaged as a set of 5, and this was not this wouldn't have been one of them. So this was added later once Dungeons and Dragons decided that they needed to do percentile dice. So speaking of dice, I thought it might be fun to look at this set of dice that I got. So this is a quick shout out to some folks. They didn't pay me for this. All they did was send me these 2 dice, and they thought that I might be able to use them in the game that I run for my daughter, which I'm going to. So this is from TOWERHOUSE Creative. And what you're going to want to do is make sure that you do watch my playlist of DM advice videos. I've had some people say that they don't have any need for DM advice videos, and I guess that's fine. I don't really necessarily, I'm not giving advice on like how to run combat and things like that. It's more like I'm showing how I change and adapt old school classic D&D adventures like Keep on the Borderlands or The Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh, how I change things in there and adapt it, and how I use it in the game that I run for my daughter. So it is DM advice based, but there's still history because everything that I'm doing in my daughter's games so far has been based on classic TSR era products. So I definitely highly recommend checking those videos out, even if you think that you're the master DM and that you could never get any more advice on how to improve your games. So I'm always looking for improvement. I've been doing this for, over 40 years, and I just think that there's always something to learn. But in any event, this is dice from TOWERHOUSE Creative. Now, they call it, I want to say NUUL, NUUL dice. And the idea is that this kind of will replace the 2d6 reaction roll that you use in this version of the game. So, which of course handy for me because that's the version that I run. And so, if you've seen my videos before, you roll 2d6, and the lower you get, the worse the reaction is of the person that you're encountering. Okay, that's the short version. The higher the version, so if you get like a 12 on 2d6, they're probably going to be very friendly and helpful. Okay, so this kind of takes that idea, but then it changes it because you see there's these little symbols on the dice. So there's like a skull for the 1, there's a money bag for the 3, there's like a little comment bubble here for the 5. There's this little weird shape for the 4, and then there's a heart for the 6, and then there's this like wing for the 2. Okay, so it describes all of these in here, and it tells you can use them as a quick reaction if you just want to roll 1 die to kind of figure somebody's out. So 1 would be a skull, hostile, chaotic. That wing is flighty or fearful, bag is bribery, bargaining, mist is uncertain or neutral, talk, diplomatic or talkative, and then heart is friendly and welcoming. However, the fun thing that you can do is roll these 1 at a time. Now, I would have preferred if there had been 2 different colors, like red and black or something, or black and white. To make it easier to kind of call out and say, like, the black is the first one and the red is the second, or like whatever. But you can just roll them 1 at a time. So I got a 1, and then I got a 2. Okay, and then you can look on the chart here and see, well, that means they will attack unless they're able to flee, and they will pursue fleeing prey, or they will attack out of fear, and they will run if approached aggressively, hit and run. So those are all ways that you can interpret what these dice mean as a way to add a little bit more nuance and context and complexity to the standard 2d6 reaction roll tables. Now, if you've watched my videos before, that I've created my own tables for how to interpret each result on those reaction tables. So I called it Why Are the Monsters Attacking? And it's sort of like, okay, once you know that they're going to attack, or even if they're not, I used attacking kind of, loosely, but even if they're friendly, figuring out why are they friendly? And I have like subtables that you can roll on. If you want those tables, just go ahead and send me an email and I'd be happy to send them to you. However, I'm going to be using this in my daughter's game because I really like how you can get these weird things like, for example, if you've got a 3 and a 1, that's money bag, and then the skull, and it's say a bribe may make this creature very hostile. Alternatively, a bribe could solve this issue without bloodshed. The creature may attempt to bribe the party or to fight something. And then, you can go all the way up to things like heart and skull. So heart is friendly, but skull is hostile or chaotic. And so then that could be the creature might seem friendly, but may lash out. The creature will kill for friends or aggressively protect those they care about. So it's a way to interpret why they're doing what they're doing, which I think is really fun. And not mentioned here, but something that I think you could use this for is just for standard encounters, regardless of whether there's a creature involved. So maybe you have weather and you've rolled on a table and determined that there's a storm. You could roll these dice and figure out, like, does the storm look really, really bad? But actually, it's going to be a lot weaker than you thought as it goes on. But you might be preparing for it to be the worst. Or it could be vice versa. You could think that, like, oh, it's just a light rain and it turns out to be a torrential disaster. So I think that's a fun way that you could use You could use it for missions as well. Maybe your players did something that you weren't expecting, and so you have to kind of pivot rather than try to force them to do something that, just because you pre-scripted it. Hopefully you're not doing that. You're being open to your players and listening to them and doing what they want to do. And so you could use these dice to help figure out, like, is this mission really hostile, or does it just seem bad, but it's actually going to be a good thing, or like whatever. So I think there's a lot of different ways that you could use this besides just in a standard encounter. There's only 250 sets made, and I'm going to put a link in the show notes below. It's not a what do you call it, like affiliate link. I don't get anything out of this other than trying to support a small creator who was kind enough to send these to me and told me in a note that he hoped that I use them in my daughter's game, which again I will. So be looking for a video when I do that at our next session. Okay, so let's talk about these different mechanics, and again, sort of like where they come from. Where did these ideas for using different styles of mechanics come from? Now, I talked a little bit about how six-sided dice were the most prevalent, and so a lot of times people would create mechanics and then figure out how to use six-sided die to emulate those types of mechanics. So an example, and I've talked a little bit about this before, this is Dawn Patrol. And this is sort of a rebranding of a game that pre-exists from TSR, written by Mike Carr, who was a friend of both Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax. He was an editor at TSR for a very long time, edited these books here. But Mike Carr created a game called Fight in the Skies that was created in the late 60s and is the only game that's been played at every single Gen Con that's ever been run. It's the only one. And I had a chance to see Mike run a game of that at DaveCon last April of 2024. I didn't play it because I was playing another game at the time, but I caught the last tail end of him running this game. But anyway, this is a rebranding by TSR, and it's the same game, rules wise. It's called Dawn Patrol, and I think there's some very light mechanics in here for some role playing. But I wanted to show you these charts just to kind of show you how people did things back in the day. So this is the percentile table used by using six-sided dice. And so this is a way of figuring out, like, if your chance of success was 5%, you would roll an 11. If it was 10%, you could roll a 9. And if it was 15%, you can roll a 6. So these numbers are changing, obviously, because there's multiple ways to get a 6 on two six-sided dice versus there's very limited ways that you could get an 11 on two six-sided dice. So you can roll 5 and 6, or you could roll a 6 and a 5. Right? So whereas to get like a 7 or a 12, the idea is like either one of those would give you 20%. And I know it seems weird that, like, why is the 12 there? Because they're trying to stack up to get to, like, these are the things that you could get to get you to 20%. So a 95% would be any number except 11. So these are tables. Now, this was a table that was adapted from another game that preexists, another war game. And but people back in the day, when they only had six-sided dice, this is the kind of stuff that they would do to come up with mechanics. Now, there's some question as to where did the different dice come from and when did they start using them for Dungeons and Dragons? So, specifically, when did Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson get exposed to these dice? And the thing is, there's no consensus. It's very interesting. And as we know from other videos that you've watched, and this isn't a complaint, but people's stories change as they get older, whether that's through age or memory failure or trying to spin something a different way. There's a dozen different reasons why you might do that. And they're not, I don't think, all nefarious, but there's 3 examples that I have heard. And one of them is that Dave Wesley, who created Braunstein, if you've seen, again, my videos in the past, Braunstein is the inspiration for the game of Blackmore. Blackmore then helps inspire the creation of Dungeons and Dragons. That's a short version. There's way more to it than that. I'm just using that as an example for 3 people that are involved in this. So Dave Wesley, creator of Braunstein, he says that he saw for sale in a catalog, I believe it was an educational catalog, those platonic solids that we talked about before, these dice here, without the 10. And he saw that and had mentioned it to Gary and to Dave that, like, those might be cool to use in a game. And so he said that, he was kind of the one that, like, exposed them to that. Separate story, completely different. Dave Arneson says, no, I was in England on a trip, and we do know that trip happened. So that's documented. We don't know exactly when, and that's a little bit more on the sketchy side. But, and it's, by sketchy, I mean, we just don't know. We don't know the exact dates as far as I'm aware. But he was in England, and he came across I saw in a store these types of dice like this, and he was thinking like, oh, those would be fun to use in a game. And for him, what he said, the quote that he said, and again, this is like decades after the fact, he said something to the effect of like, magic should be chaotic and magical and crazy and weird and like whatever. And so it required using dice like this. He specifically pointed out the D20 as something that you would use to add like a random element to magic. Okay, then later on, you have Gary Gygax, also way after the fact, saying, well, no, what it really was that there were war games that had started to be exposed to of these different dice, specifically the D20, which at the time was not numbered 1 through 20, but they would have been numbered usually 0 through 9 twice. And by doing that, you could generate a percentile from 1 to 100 using the 0 to 9, like roll once, that's your 10s, and then you roll again, and that's your 1s, right? So again, they didn't have as much access to 10-sided dice as they had to these 20s. However, Gary realized if you colored one set of 0 to 9, if you inked them in, like I was talking about before, if you ink them in a different color, then you could specify that your D20 was actually rolling 1 to 20, not a percentile, because 0 through 9, that would have been like your 1 through 10 essentially. And then the second 0 through 9 that was colored in, inked differently, that would have been your 11 through 20. And so then he realized, oh, if I do that, then I can generate increments of 5%. And he thought that that was something that was going to be very important for this war game that he was involved with called Tractics. But also he mentions in a letter, 1973, that he's working on some tables for a fantasy game, and that he thought that this D20, this 20-sided die, would be very helpful in making those tables. So we know that Gary was pretty enamored with this idea of how to generate different types of results, different probabilities with different styles of dice. So much so that he actually writes a whole section in the 1979 Dungeon Master's Guide, specifically just about how to use dice to generate different probabilities. This is down here, right at the very beginning of the book, and he talks about dice being the tools of your trade and using bell curves, ascending and descending, and generating greater probability towards the center of the group. And then he even goes so far as to start graphing and showing what the different probabilities are. You've got linear curves, and you've got your bell curve for a 3d6. And he talks about using single die or multiple dice read in succession. And then he says, he talks about, basically the nomenclature using the D for a dice type. And then he talks about, generating different probabilities, like the D4 can generate 25% increments, and then you can add numbers to generate different things. So it's nothing really groundbreaking, but it takes up quite a bit of space where he's talking about how you can generate all these different kinds of probabilities with, by using the different dice. He talks about averaging dice, and then I always thought this part was kind of fun as a kid. He talks about how he has a D6 with the following faces: spade, club, club, diamond, diamond, heart. My parents had those dice. They had a little small leather case, and it had dice just like this. So they kept it in a drawer that they used to play cribbage, and I'm not sure if that's what they used it for, but I'm hoping that my dad still has them after he moved, because I used to play with them all the time when I was a kid. But anyway, this section really went over my head when I was a kid, because I wasn't super interested in it. I wasn't great at math, and I didn't really get the probability thing, or that I needed to know, because I figured the rules are just going to tell me what dice to roll. But this is just, more ammunition for this idea that, like, Gary really liked the idea of using different kinds of dice to create different probabilities, which is why I think partially there are so many different subsystems. Now, I talked to Rob Kuntz briefly. We chatted on social media, and I was talking to him about this idea of why there were these different subsystems that are non-unified in original Dungeons and Dragons. And Rob Kuntz was one of the original people who was involved in the creation of Dungeons and Dragons. So, of course, you've got the two co-creators, Gygax and Arneson. But when Gary was testing out his Greyhawk campaign, and Greyhawk was Gary's answer to Blackmore. Okay, so when he was running that, Rob Kuntz very quickly started to also run Greyhawk games with Gary. They kind of co-GM'd, and sometimes they would take turns and things like that. So he was involved at the very, very, very early stages of game design. Before Dungeons and Dragons even existed, he was running games in Greyhawk prior to the publication of this. So, he is one of the kind of old timers and original people that is still with us. And so I was chatting with him and I said, what was the reason why Gary did this? And, just to give you, again, a sense of how involved Rob Kuntz was, he helped write the Greyhawk supplement 1. Okay, 1975. So we're going to talk about this book more in just a second. But Rob told me that basically it was just Gary's way of wanting to be able to generate different types of probabilities, because he saw that as a feature, so that not everything was going to be a linear curve on a D20. And so he thought that different systems required different game mechanics, and that was seen as a feature of this type of system. And then he goes so far to say that in his mind, from a game design standpoint, this is Rob Kuntz talking, he said that having a unified core mechanic to him is sort of like putting the cart before the horse, meaning you're coming up with what system you're going to use in order to figure out and determine the outcome of a situation before you've even determined what those situations are and how they should be adjudicated. You've already decided that no matter what it is, you're going to apply the same mechanic. And to him, he thinks that's kind of poor game design. So I thought that was kind of interesting, because I'd never really thought of it that way before. When I was playing D&D as a kid, when I started playing with this and this, similar to this and similar to this, all of these have non-unified game mechanics. And because that's what I started with, it didn't seem weird to me. But then when I was exposed to 3rd edition and the unified core mechanic, the D20, apply your, bonus or penalty, some kind of modifier, and then compare it to a target number. And I thought wow, that's super easy. How come they didn't do that before? Gary didn't know what he was doing. There's this perception, even there's a perception among players now that start with new editions and then try to go backwards and start a play with some of these. They think that there was no design philosophy behind this. Well, there actually was. It's just not the philosophy that you would think that it would be. It's a different kind of game design. So there are really sort of 4 main, mechanics that are used in these early editions. If you boil it down, you can kind of boil it down to 4. And really, it's going to get boiled down to 3 eventually, but it sort of starts out with sort of 4. Okay, so I'm going to talk about those now, and then talk about why they were used and where Gary got these ideas. Okay, so because we know one of the things that we know about Gary, if you've watched my videos before, he likes to borrow. He likes to take concepts from things that he's read before in other games, from other people, and then adapt them and incorporate them into what he's doing. So we know he, so-called borrowed the thief class. I have a whole video on that, because he didn't create that. That came from the Aero Hobbies group out here in Santa Monica in the Los Angeles area. And I'm going to talk about the thief in a second, because it's going to be related to one of these types of mechanics that we're talking about system wise. But he, the ranger class, the bard class, the illusionist, all those came from other people. And Gary doesn't always necessarily go out of his way to kind of acknowledge who those folks are. He thanks them in here, but it's buried at the bottom, of, what is it? The foreword or the preface. It's buried down in here in the preface. We've talked about this before, where he kind of acknowledges the names of the people who created, for example, the Ranger class. He doesn't call out what that person did. He just lists the name. And then, of course, Gary goes on to say that he is the sole author of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, even though he's thanked other people for the concepts that he took. But that's not necessarily related to this idea of using dice, with the exception of understanding that Gary is being influenced by what other people have done, and then he's adapting it. So let's talk about some of those influences. Well, one of them, of course, is going to be kind of Chainmail. So Chainmail is originally designed by Jeff Parent. So so take out the fantasy supplement. The medieval miniatures rules were originally developed by Jeff Parent, and they were published in the Domesday Book. And, Gary's involved, but like the core concept of the way that this game is adjudicated in Chainmail, it's 2d6. It's using 2d6 because they were super readily available. 2 6-sided dice to help determine the outcome of combat and other situations that are going to arise. Okay. Now, Gary's main contribution to this is the fantasy supplement that we've talked about before. And that's not really coming up with new rules systems. It's adapting a different genre, fantasy, to the system that had been created in Chainmail. And even so much so that a lot of the information that Gary puts in the fantasy supplement here in the back was actually originally published in another game. It was a Middle-earth war game, but I want to say the guy's name's... Is it Bath? I'm going to put it up here on the screen because I can't quite remember what his name is off the top of my head. But he had developed a game for playing Middle-earth war games. And Gary adapted a lot of that for this fantasy supplement. So again, this idea of like being, I'm going to be generous here and say he's being inspired by other people's creations. Okay. But that is a 2d6 system. Now, I also played in a game at DaveCon back in April 2024. This is now September. And when I'm recording this, but back in just a few months ago, I played in a game at DaveCon run by Bill Hoyt, who was part of Dave Arneson's Blackmore crew. He's part of the Blackmore bunch. He's one of those Minneapolis Twin City gamers. And he ran a game that was sort of like a recreation of a game that Dave Arneson had used to run way back in the day. So this is sort of like in that in-between era where, Blackmore hasn't been fully fleshed out yet. And Dave Arneson ran a game that involved bandits and Vikings, and there were knights in a castle run by a baron, and there were peasants and different kinds of peasants, and everyone had different goals. I've talked a little bit about this game before. I'll put a link to that video up here. It was a really interesting experience, but that game's resolution mechanic was using 2d6 to determine outcomes. So this game was out there, and so people, or this scenario that Dave ran using this 2d6 mechanic, these were the types of mechanics that a lot of these war gamers were used to. So when you get to original Dungeons and Dragons and it's talking about how to run combat, the combat in here is based on 2d6. So your dice for cumulative hits, this is how many 6-sided dice you're using to determine how many hits you can take. Okay. And in terms of figuring out like how many wounds you're going to cause and all that kind of stuff, everything is like 2d6 based. Okay, so that makes sense because it's sort of based on this idea of like that had come before. So this is sort of like, for me, like the first of the 4 different mechanics that you're going to see in this, which is 2d6. Now 2d6 is going to go away pretty quickly, but it is in here in other places as well. So as an example, the cleric turn undead table is based on 2d6. So that is like a subsystem, and it's it's just part of the game. This is like what we're going to eventually see in something like this with the reaction roll table and Dungeons and Dragons, the Moldvay basic, is this 2d6 reaction roll table to figure out, like, is this person going to attack? Now, this is in regard to like hiring, like what is the attitude of the person that you're attempting to hire, but it's a similar kind of mechanic. Okay, so you've got 2d6 for that. I mentioned you've got 2d6 for clerics turning undead. Okay, which is listed in here later. There we go. Finally. So you're rolling 2d6 to determine, how many undead you're going to turn and like what's going to happen when they do that. Okay. So that is a mechanic. Now, the other thing though that you have in here is this alternative combat system. And it talks about rolling a d20. Now, this is going to end up, as I've talked before, this is going to end up becoming the primary system that we use for combat and that we still use today, rolling a d20 and comparing it to a target number. Now, in this case, the target number is gotten from looking at a table Okay, and remember, this is using descending armor class. I've talked all about this before, but 9 was no armor or shield, and then the best you could get was 2, which was plate armor and shield, unless you had magic, and then you could technically go into the negative on this system. But you're comparing it to a target number here, okay? And then saving throws work the same way. You're rolling a 20-sided die, and then you're comparing it to a target number to see if you succeed at your save. So that's the early start of doing that. Now, why is Gary doing that? Why is he creating this alternative combat system when he's already got a system in here? Well, a few different reasons. So the main one is, if you look at what's required for this particular game. So this is a box set, remember, 3 different booklets, and it costs $10 back in 1974, which is a lot of money. It's a lot of money, and especially for what you were getting. And then it tells you all these other things that you need, and it doesn't come with these. It says you need dice, but it doesn't come with the dice. Okay, and then it says that you need a game, Outdoor Survival, a completely different game published by a completely different game company, Avalon Hill. So that's another thing that you have to get. And then it says you need Chainmail, another game. Now, it says the latest edition is available directly from TSR Hobbies. At the time that the original 1974 version, this is a later printing, that would have been published, I believe, by Guidon Games. Still at that time, it hadn't yet been published by TSR. You can see my versions published by TSR because I have a later printing. But my point is, it is yet another game that you had to buy. So there's all these different things that you're buying on top of the $10 that you spent to buy this. The dice alone at this time were so hard to come by. They were probably going to cost you another $6. And you'd probably have to pay for shipping, because it's not like you were going to go down to your local game store and go buy these dice. That didn't happen back then. Okay, so there's a reason then, I think, that Gary then decides that it might be beneficial to create an alternative combat system. So one of the reasons that I think Gary, was really interested in kind of developing this alternative combat system is, well, one, he really liked this idea of the 20-sided dice. He was really excited about using 20-sided die and the 5% increments that you could use with that particular die. And so I think he was trying to come up with a system that would allow him to use that die, because, again, as he mentions up here, he says that you need all these different dice, but really, you can play original D&D if you kind of know what you're doing with just 6-siders. So at the time, as an example, all weapons do 6 dice of damage, like D6. Everyone, dagger, sword, halberd, doesn't matter. Everything does D6. Every character used a D6 for hit dice, as an example. So there's a way to get around this without needing all these dice. But by having an alternative combat system that uses a D20, well, Gary's then giving you an excuse to have a D20 and use it. He's also, I think he likes the idea of doing it, as we see. Again, this is years later, but you can already tell in the Dungeon Master's Guide here how excited Gary is about the probabilities that are generated with different types of dice. And so having something that's a linear curve instead of a bell curve from a 2d6, I think, is something that he was really interested in. And then from a marketing standpoint, it makes sense to develop a system that doesn't require players to have another book. It doesn't require you to buy Chainmail. And this was something also that I think, Gary can kind of claim like this is his, right? The 2d6 system is definitely coming from Chainmail and other previous war games that came before. So by creating something where you run combat using a d20, that's something that Gary can definitely, as a claim to fame, kind of say that's something that he kind of created, because there weren't a lot of games out there at the time that were resolving mechanical issues using 20-sided dice. There are a few, again, I think Corns was using it and Tractix, things like that, but not a lot. And so this is something that, again, is going to help appeal to kids or players who don't have a war game background and don't know the Chainmail system, because the Chainmail system isn't really super explained in here. It just says you need to have it. And so rather than waste space by repeating something that's in Chainmail, he instead creates a system that he explains that's brand new. That is, and there's no doubt like why that ended up catching on, because it didn't require you to buy another book. You could just use this and the alternative combat system. So it's no wonder that that one became the core system. Okay, so but it, again, it starts out with that 2d6. Okay, so that's kind of like one of the systems that you have. So as far as like this kind of dividing up of these systems and like sort of like what are the three main ones, there's really a lot more than just three. But if you kind of wanted to put them into three buckets, or four with the 2d6, this idea, I kind of I'd seen it before, but what really kind of grabbed my attention is a blog called Wasted Lands Fantasy, and so I'm going to put a link to that down in the show notes. But the author of that blog kind of helped coalesce this all into something that I think is easily digestible. But another place where I got ideas for this is from Delta's D&D Hotspot blog, and I've worked with that author before. There was of that blog, there was a time where he was a judge for the one-page dungeon contest that I am also a judge on, and so we kind of interacted briefly for the year that he was a judge. But I wanted to talk about outdoor survival. Okay, and this is going to lead us into the second kind of, again, if you want to call it a bucket or system, mechanic of using different dice for different types of situations, and that is going to be the X and 6. Okay, so in outdoor survival, there are different ways to, and the reason Gary says that you want to have outdoor survival in here is partly for the map. There's the hex map for using outdoor travel, but there are systems in that game for determining things like foraging for food and water, and do you become lost, and you roll a d4 when you enter a hex, and if you roll 1 through 4, then nothing happens. If you roll a 5 or a 6, though, you then have to adjudicate, like, is there something in there, a wandering monster as an example. So those kinds of things. So this idea of rolling a d6, and typically in these rolls, something on a 1 or a 2 means that something happens. Now, in the case of the encounter, or whatever you want to say, the 5 or a 6, sometimes you're rolling high, but in general, you're going to be rolling low, and and the 1 or a 2 means that the thing happens. I got lost, or I found water, or I found food, or whatever the case may be. So that's interesting. And we see that rule applied, or that mechanic, I should say, that D6, X and 6 mechanic, applied like liberally throughout this book. This is book 3 of the original 3 books, set Underwater and Wilderness Adventures. So if you look in here, I mean, it's listed throughout different things that are going to happen. So an example, roll a die for, and so, and again, as a reminder, every time you see in this version of the game, when it says die, unless it specifies, that means it's a d6. Roll the die for every room or space not already allocated. A roll of a 1 or a 2 indicates that there is some monster there. Roll again from every room or space. A roll of 1 to 3 in those rooms or spaces with monsters indicates some form of treasure, right? So you're rolling a d6, and it's usually on a roll of 1, a roll of 1 to 2, or one roll of 1, 2, or 3, usually. Not always, but usually that means that a thing happens. But it's found throughout here, all these different kinds of things. Secret passages will be relocated on a roll of a 1 or a 2 on a 6-sided die by men, dwarves, or halflings. Elves will be able to locate them on a roll of 1 to 4 on a d6. And I'm going to address that in a second, but because there's some interesting reasons why that's the case. Doors must be forced open by strength. A roll of a 1 or a 2 indicating that the door opens. So it's not a strength roll. It's a separate mechanic. You're rolling a d6, and on a 1 or a 2, the door opens, and you move in and you move on. Okay, so you see that throughout here. Traps are usually sprung on a roll of a 1 or a 2 when a party passes over one of them. Okay, so where's this idea come from? Well, we already discussed that it came from outdoor survival, but there's another game where this mechanic comes from, especially this bit about elves finding secret doors. So when Gary is first exposed to Dave Arneson's Blackmore, Dave Arneson has left the Minneapolis area. He travels to Lake Geneva to show his Blackmore game to Gary. Well, he comes along with one of his friends, another gentleman by the name of Dave McGarry. And Dave McGarry has created a game called Dungeon with an exclamation point. And the short way to describe this is that the Dungeon board game is essentially trying to boil down the experience and the concepts and the atmosphere of playing in a dungeon crawl and a Blackmore type game, but applying it to a board game setting that is more familiar to people, that might have been more familiar with someone who didn't have a wargaming background, right? Playing this, it tells you that, you don't really need miniature figures. It tells you that right out the gate. Like, you don't need miniature figures. You can play without. You don't need a map, or, like a battle map is what I'm talking about, battle map. So you don't need that. And so then it starts to become a little bit confusing for people who don't have familiarity with this kind of thing. It's like, how do you play this game? There's no board. There's no pieces. How do I move? How do I know where I am? Like, all these kinds of things. But the board game Dungeon is again, it's going to apply those more familiar rules of board games, but trying to, again, replicate, as close as possible what it might be like to dungeon crawl in a Blackmore style of setting. Well, in the game of Dungeon, the board game Dungeon, there are 4 different types of characters that you can play. There's the wizard, there's the hero, there's the superhero, and there's the elf. Okay, so Dave McGarry shows this game to Gary Gygax. Well, one of the interesting things that the elf can do is find secret doors at double the chance of any other character in the game. So in the game of Dungeon, the elf finds a secret door on a roll of 1 to 4 on a d6. Every other character finds a secret door on a roll of 1 or a 2 on a d6. Just like we saw in here just a second ago about the secret doors. So obviously, Gary had been exposed to that concept, that mechanic, before this game is written and published. So he sees that game. It could have been 1972. Other people say it's probably 1973. I think there's not necessarily a consensus of exactly when that meeting happened, but it was somewhere in that time period, right? This is published in 1974. So Gary's already seen that in Dungeon. He's seen that mechanic of rolling a d6. And then you see him apply it liberally throughout the rules in here, where there are certain situations where, traps, wandering monsters, secret doors, hearing noise, all these kinds of things use a d6 mechanic in this version of the game. And that then goes on to, like in this version, okay, the one, Moldvay Basic, and there are some D6 mechanics also in Advanced D&D. So that is a mechanic that gets moved forward through time until, again, you get to 3rd edition. Okay, but before that, this was one of the systems, and it is one of the more elegant systems. You don't need to look at a table. You don't need to remember the exact rules of how a thing works. You don't have to apply bonuses or penalties. You just roll a d6, and on a 1 or 2, the thing happens. So, and I think that one of the beautiful parts about it is that from a referee standpoint, or being a fledgling DM or whatever you want to call it, when you're exposed to this game, when you start to see that that's how things are adjudicated, then you get an understanding that, like, if a player asks to do something that's not in the rules, you can just say, roll a d6, and on a 1 or a 2, that thing works, and then you move on with the game. So yeah, it's, I guess, kind of arbitrary in the fact that it doesn't account for player or character experience, or, abilities and things like that. But I think that's part of the beauty of it. It's just roll it and move on with the game. Like, it's going to be fine. So I really like that. I use that rule all the time in the game that I run for my daughter and her friends, because, I will tell you, if you want people to come up with ideas that you didn't know they were going to, you didn't expect, and that are probably not going to be covered in the rules, play an old style game. Like the one I play, BX, play that with a group of kids and just watch them come up with these things that you had no idea in a million years a player would ask to do. And then you have to figure out really quickly how to adjudicate it. And I think one of the best ways of doing it, depending on the situation, sometimes I just say, yes, it works. But other times, roll that D6 and we'll see if that happens. So that is sort of like the second of these mechanics. And it's related to the 2d6 because they're both using d6s. But this idea of like different situations in the game calling for the roll of a d6 is sort of like the second, for me, kind of concepts that you are going to apply in a game like this. That is one of these non-unified subsystems, but one that carries on throughout most editions of, pre-Wizards of the Coast Dungeons and Dragons. So the third kind of, subsystem or mechanic that we're going to see, and we've kind of briefly already talked about it, but that's going to be the D20 mechanic, which is usually going to be reserved for combat. So, and again, that's going to be only if you're using the alternative combat system from original Dungeons and Dragons, which then, of course, becomes the default that we see throughout every edition of D&D from this point forward, all the way up until now. It's 2024, and we're still using D20 for combat. But the D20 system is also, combat includes things like rolling for saving throws. Again, we talked about that earlier. So now, interestingly, I talked about how the 2d6 system in here for turning undead, again, that's based on that bell curve. Now, that system gets picked up here in Moldvay Basic, rolling 2d6 to figure out your undead turning. However, this is different. In Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, Gary changes that 2d6 table for clerics turning undead and switches it over to being based on a d20 roll. So I pulled out my player handbook, but I actually think that that's in the Dungeon Master's Guide, where it talks about turning undead, and there's a table for adjudicating that. And it's based on a d20. So he's changed the system. And that makes sense because he's keeping it consistent with the d20 combat system that he created, the alternative combat system. So it's going to be here on page 7. And, I've talked about this before. I really just don't get the organization of this book. And I know there's people that say, like, how can you say that? It's organized great. Well, look, I don't really get that, but here's your d20 for rolling, and so it's different. You're linear. You're going to have a linear curve now instead of a bell curve, and it completely changes the probability. But it makes it more consistent with how he adjudicated combat by changing to rolling a d20. But again, as an example of why I think that this book is kind of screwy, is this table down here for clerics affecting undead comes after the tables for assassinations. However, alphabetically in the game, the assassin comes technically after the cleric because the cleric class comes first, and the assassin is a subclass of thief, which comes later. So if you put them in the order that the classes were in, then the cleric table should have been first. Also, there's a table all the way up here for assassins talking about spying, the chance of spying as an assassin. Okay, where is it? Oh, there's poison. Here's your assassin spying table. Okay, but then the assassination table is all the way back over here. So, and I'm going to talk about those in a second, but that's some of what I'm talking about, where it's so hard to find what you're looking for in this book without using the index. But you have, again, this third subsystem of rolling a d20, okay, to figure out combat-related things. And again, that's why they moved the cleric turning undead table to a d20. I prefer 2d6. I like the bell curve for the cleric undead table. I also think the 2d6 table, like the, roll a 1 or a 2 on a d6 to see if the thing happens, rolling 2d6 and creating 2d6 tables where the more general common outcomes are in the center, and in a like 6, 7, or 8, and then the really weird outlier cases are a 2 or a 12. I think that's brilliant design. I love creating 2d6 tables, and I do it all the time. Okay, but you also have a different kind of d20 mechanic. This is where things start to get a little bit, I don't want to say screwy. It's sort of just knowing what to roll and when to roll it. But you have in Moldvay Basic D&D, there's a section in here on dungeon mastering as a fine art. It's one of my favorite sections in this whole rule book. And there's a section up here, which is there's always a chance. DM might want to base a character's chance on doing something on his or her ability scores, strength, dexterity, and so forth. To perform a difficult task, such as climbing up a rope or thinking of a forgotten clue, the player should roll the ability score less on a d20, and then the DM may give a bonus or penalty to the roll depending on the difficulty of the action. Okay, so roll of 1 should always succeed, and roll of 20 should always fail. So that's a d20 roll under mechanic. So it's the opposite of the combat, and in this case, your so-called target number is your ability score. So you just have to roll your ability score lower, and then you do the thing that you want to do. So very simple, very easy to figure out. There's no level-based bonuses. There's no applying modifiers and having to figure all that out. You don't even have to figure out the target number because the target number is written on your sheet. It's your ability score. So that system is going to end up becoming the non-weapon proficiency system that I debuts in the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons hardback book called Oriental Adventures. I just did a video on that, and it was one of my favorite books from back in the day from Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. But that creates the system of, what was called non-weapon proficiencies that then eventually gets incorporated into second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And here it is optional, but it was really a core part of the system. And it is a roll under system. It is having a number and then rolling a d20, rolling under, whatever skill or non-weapon proficiency you had that is associated usually with one of your ability scores. And that was the system. So it is technically another system, even though it is a d20 system because it's d20 roll under, but it is still comparing, for all intents and purposes, to a target number. It's just in the case of combat, your target number, you want to beat that number. And in the case of your ability score, you want to be lower than that number. It's a roll under mechanic, but it's still using a d20. So kind of a bit of an outlier, I guess. Maybe it's subsystem 3A, whatever you want to call it, but it is a d20 based mechanic for adjudicating solutions. And we saw that, Gary he really liked this idea of the D20. He wrote a whole article about it in a magazine in 1973, or a newsletter, whatever it was, about his excitement for figuring out the D20. And so I think the more uses that he could come up with for that, for him, kind of like the better. Now, he didn't write that rule in this. That was written by Tom Mulvey, who edited this edition. But he did oversee, I guess, in a way, the development of Oriental Adventures, where Dave Zeb Cook created the non-weapon proficiency system. And just as an aside on that, Dave Zeb Cook was one of the designers of the expert rules for this edition here. He was Steve Marsh. It's credited. It says edited by Dave Cook, but really it was actually a lot of it was written by Steve Marsh, and he always doesn't get credit, which sucks. But anyway, Dave Cook was involved with this. This is based on this, which is that roll under mechanic, and then Dave Zeb Cook is the guy who wrote Oriental Adventures to create non-weapon proficiencies using the same mechanics that went all the way back to this edition, and then go forward into this edition. I just think that's really kind of interesting. Okay, so that's the D20 mechanic that you have now. The last subsystem that we have would be the percentile-based subsystems. And the first place I kind of think it shows up is in this supplement. I told you we were going to come back to this one. So this is Supplement 1 Greyhawk, 1975. And in this book, you have the debut of the thief class. Okay, so thieves, or rogues, if you want to call them that, did not exist before this particular book. And so they debut in here, and they have different abilities, thief abilities. A lot of people say they're skills. I like to use the word abilities because in this version of the game, these were not things that everybody could do. These were only allowed for thief type characters. And of course, I can't find the having trouble finding the thief table. Here we go, finally. Okay, so statistics regarding thieves. And so it shows you by level. So this is, and again, these are level titles. So rather than saying level 1, 2, and 3, it was apprentice, footpad, and robber. Those are your first 3 levels of thief, then burglar, cut purse, sharper, pilfer, master pilfer, and then thief, master thief. Okay, so it shows you by level what % chance they have to open locks, to remove traps. Really interesting here. A lot of people forget this. This is not find or remove traps. This is remove traps. So this is not about finding it. It's knowing that it's there, and then can you remove it? Then pickpockets, move silently, hide in shadows. And then you have hear noise. Now, these are all based on percentages. Hear noise, of course, this is based on a D6 because this was something that every character can do. Every character can listen. Only thieves are going to get better, though. The thief is the only class that's going to get better at hearing noise as time goes on. The other classes are not. Okay, but it uses that same. So this is a case where a lot of people will complain about this and go like, first off, why are the thief skills based on percentages in the first place? And then secondly, why are some of them percentages, but then hear noise is a D6? Well, that's because this, again, is something that every character can do. Other characters can't do these things. That's why I don't like to call these skills. So other characters don't have the ability to pick a lock. Okay, so because thieves are trained. Thieves are trained to do that. And this is a special skill that they can do in the right circumstances with the right tools. Other characters can try to break a lock. They can bust it open with strength, but a thief can pick a lock. I've talked all about this before, but I think it's better to call these thief abilities rather than skills, because these are abilities that are limited to the thief class, just like turning undead is limited to the cleric class. Okay, but you have these based on percentages. Now, I've talked with the original player of the thief class that kind of helped design it at the Aero Hobbies group out in Santa Monica. His name's Daryl Wagner. And so he was the person that kind of created the thief class. Now, we know that thieves were played as a role or an archetype in Dave Arneson's Blackmore games. So I had a long talk with Dave McGarry when I went to DaveCon back in April. And he was like technically the first thief player in a role-playing game, which was Blackmore. And it was because Dave Arneson showed up at a game and said, you're going to play a thief, and just told him that. But remember, they were not necessarily classes in the way that we think of them from Dungeons and Dragons in Blackmore. So what you had were, again, like roles or archetypes. So Dave McGarry was playing a character that was a thief, but it didn't have like specified abilities and tables and all that kind of stuff like that we associate with thieves. Okay. But the character class that we're familiar with that appears in here was created by a group of gamers out at the Aero Hobbies group. And then the owner of the store, Gary Switzer, he was part of that group. He ends up calling Gary Gygax, explaining the thief class to Gary Gygax over the phone. Gary Gygax takes notes, publishes it in the Great Plains Games Players newsletter, and he specifically calls out Gary Switzer and the Aero Hobbies group in that article that they were playing this class. But then he revises it in this book, and he adds these percentages, as you saw, for the different thief abilities. Now, Daryl Wagner told me that they didn't play it that way, that for them, originally, those thief abilities were closer to like magic user spells. And again, that's why I like to call them thief abilities, because they're above and beyond. They're almost bordering on supernatural in this version of the class. And so, but Gary adds these percentages chances. Now, this is like, I think, and I could be wrong, but I think it's the first time that percentages were applied to player character abilities in Dungeons and Dragons was the thief class in here. However, that's going to become and kind of set the stage for having other types of percentage-based chances in Dungeons and Dragons. So after the thief skills were identified in Greyhawk as being percentages, Gary Gygax, thereafter starts working on advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And in this book here, the Player's Handbook, 1978, he keeps the thief skills, or thief abilities. Sorry, I just said I called them abilities, not skills, but he keeps them as percentages. Okay. Now, in this case, he's switched hear noise. You see that. He's changed from that die 6, and that is now based on percentages. Okay. There's some other things in here that also get changed, or not changed, but get, noted as being based on percentages. So if you look at a ranger's ability to track, tracking is possible both outdoors and underground, dungeon-like settings, and then he gives you the chance to track, which is based on a percentage. And then there's abilities that change that, or factors that change that. If you go to the appendices in the back, there's a bard class in here. and they have legend, lore, and item knowledge, which is based on a percentage. Okay. Then you also have the assassination table. So we looked at this briefly just a few minutes ago, but I didn't really show it. But it is based on a percentage. Now, the original assassination table was created by Tim Kask for supplement to Blackmore back in 1975. But again, it was based on a percentage. Okay, so, and that was after the Thief class had debuted. So Gary's now creating kind of like this, you know, the fourth of our subsystems of our mechanics, which is having percentages being used for character class abilities that are based on like a chance. So there are some abilities that classes just do or don't do. So druids have certain abilities that are listed in here, and those are not based on any kind of like chance where they have to roll to see if it works. It just works. But if there is a possibility for a chance of failure, then for the most part, these class-based abilities are going to be based on percentages. Now, of course, we just saw with the cleric turning undead, that's based on a D20 roll, but that's because it's closer to something that you would do in combat, okay? Whereas something like the thief abilities or, you know, like the bardic lore, things like that, that could be done out of combat. Those aren't combat related, and so they are based on percentages. Now, these buckets where you've got 2d6 being used for some things, you've got the d6 and then roll a 1 or a 2 and a thing happens. You have the d20 being used for combat, but also the d20 roll under for ability checks, and then you have the percentages for class-based skills. So those are really neat, tidy buckets, and they don't always work. It doesn't always work that way, but in general, they did work that way. Now, one of the interesting things that happens, again, is you have all these different subsystems going all the way up through 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And concurrently at the same time, you had in the non-advanced version of D&D, so you know, you have the Moldvay Basic, which I've talked about. Then you have the Beckme line edited by Frank Metzner. Then you have the Rule Cyclopedia, which is sort of just a distillation of Beckme without the Immortals part in a single book. And then you've got like the Black Box, the you know, the easy to master version. You've got classic D&D. All of those are essentially just restatements of the Beckme line. But those have the differing mechanics as well. So all the way up through, so this comes out in 1989 and lasts until the year 2000, you have these different subsystems. So, you know, again, we talked about the non-weapon proficiencies here, but you have thief abilities or rogue abilities, whatever you want to call them, that are based on percentages. Okay. Now, in this case, they work differently because you kind of can pick which ones you want and all that kind of stuff, but they're still percentage based. So all that's going to change. All that's going to change with the release of this book into the year 2000. This is the Player's Handbook for 3rd edition by Wizards of the Coast. And all of those different things that you saw are going to be changed to a D20 roll. Even something like initiative, which there's no initiative in this game. It just doesn't exist. Initiative in advanced D&D, as I recall, is based on a D10 roll. But in here, this is based on a D6 and it's side initiative. You roll a D6, highest goes first. So all of those different subsystems are going to change and be based on a single die 20 mechanic where you're rolling a D20, you are applying a modifier, either a bonus or a penalty, based on usually your ability score, but also could be based on other factors. And then you're comparing it to a target number. Okay, so it's removing all of those different roll under mechanics. It's changing everything. Thief abilities, non-weapon proficiencies, or, you know, now called skills in here, combat, saving throws, initiative, clerics turning undead, which is called channel divinity, as I recall, and you know, just everything that we just talked about. Finding things like, you know, or listening at a door is going to be part of your, you know, your search or your perception in 5th edition, whatever you want to call it. All those different roles are going to be changed to be a D20 versus a target number. So a lot of people really liked that. A lot of people really like that. And when I first saw it, I was like, I get this now. I get, like, that makes sense to me. I had never really thought that this didn't make sense necessarily. Like having the different subsystems hadn't really bothered me until I played this. And then I was like, oh, I get it now. And this was the first game where I really felt like I was getting a peek behind the curtain about how the mechanics worked. Because in especially advanced D&D, so much of how the game was run was kept in here. It was kept away from the players. And in this case, there was a change in design philosophy, which is let's put all the rules that the players need. Now, a lot of that happened in this edition as well. They moved some of the stuff that had been before in the Dungeon Master's Guide in first edition D&D, and they put it in this book for second edition for the players. But it was really a big deal in this. Like pretty much every rule that you need is going to be in the player's handbook. And then because it was that unified mechanic, I really felt like, oh, I kind of get how this system works and how everything works together. However, there's a downside to that. And I think that I'm going to give you an example of that downside. But one of the things that happens in this system is because everything is based on the same role, everything that you do starts to feel very much the same. So if you're rolling a D20 for combat, but you're also rolling a D20 to listen at a door, it kind of changes how you look at those two activities in the game. And it doesn't have to, but because this starts to feel the same, it kind of makes combat feel a little bit less special, because in earlier editions of the game, the D20 was pretty much reserved just for combat type situations. And now that you're rolling it for everything, that means combat doesn't have that special place anymore. Okay. So one of the things that people started to kind of realize, and I didn't realize it at the time, it took me years to figure this out. But one of the things people say about this is that everything starts to feel the same. Everything feels kind of samey, and nothing like really stands out. And an extreme example of that and that design philosophy happens in this edition, in fourth. And this is one of the main things that I've complained about in this design. And if you like fourth, more power to you. And I had great time. The few times that I did play fourth edition, I've talked talked about it a few times here on the channel before. And it's fine. It's fine for what it is. I think had it been marketed as a different game and not Dungeons and Dragons, if it had been marketed, even if they called it like the Dungeons and Dragons tactical war game and marketed it to a different audience and kept the original line going, I think it could have done better. But it was a complete replacement. And one of the things that happens in this game is that every single class gets level-based powers, and they get the same kind. They get at-will, encounter, daily, and utility powers, to the point where the wizard's spells are reskinned as being powers, and they have utility and daily and all that kind of stuff. So everything happens where like a fighter has 20th level powers that they use, or exploits. Every class calls them something different, but they're all the same kind of thing. Okay. So fighters, martial classes have exploits, and, casters have spells or like whatever. But a fighter has 20th level exploits that on a power curve level are the exact same in terms of mechanically what happens during a round and how much damage it can do as a wizard's 20th level spell. And so all of the classes, and again, this is, to me, I know people will argue about this, and a lot of people say, no, the powers are all completely different. Yeah, they're flavored different, but mechanically, when it comes down to how much damage they're doing, they're all basically doing the same thing when you look at the mathematics behind it. And so they all started to feel like very, very much the same. And it was one of the complaints about this game, is that there's very little differentiation between the classes, even though they tried to tell you that there was. There kind of isn't as much as I think people thought that there was supposed to be. And so the game starts to feel, again, so much the same because there's little differentiation. Well, that is a very similar complaint that you can make about the D20 unified mechanic in third edition, and I'll say also in fifth edition. It's one of the things that like old timers don't necessarily like about fifth edition. And again, there's nothing wrong with that edition. I quite like it. I don't play it currently, but I've had fun. And if someone else wanted to run it, I would play it. But one of the things that people do kind of have problems with is that because you're rolling a D20 to do everything, the other dice get very little use other than like maybe rolling some damage. And, you know, I guess if you roll for hit points, a lot of people don't even do that anymore. They just take max at each level or like whatever it is, and there's no rolling. So you're kind of left with like, well, I only need a D20. And then I guess if I need a different damage, I need that damage die. But all of the subsystems kind of have melted away and just become one system. And part of the complaint about that is that if you have mechanics or situations that are different, dungeon exploring, wilderness exploring, combat, and let's say, like figuring out secret lore as an example. Okay, well, all three of those should feel different because you're doing different things. But if you reduce all of them to just rolling a D20, then it kind of just becomes a mathematical exercise and you sort of lose the specialness of each one of those types of things. So I know a lot of people aren't going to agree with this and are going to say like, this is not designed well. I've heard people say it's haphazard. There was no rhyme or reason to why these systems were put in place. And it can seem like that until you really try to kind of look at, which is what I'm trying to do in this video, is help people understand there was a design philosophy here. Gary might not always have had necessarily the exact right thing in place, but he was trying different things. And one of the design philosophies was this idea that different types of actions in the game should use different mechanics so that as a player, you know that you're doing something different. So a lot of things that happen in early editions where you talk about like system mastery, in these versions of the game, system mastery is really for the referee and players as well, but mostly for a referee to understand that this situation calls for different mechanics. It's not a combat situation, so I don't need my D20. I need my percentile dice, or I need a D6, or I need a handful of D6s, whatever it is, to figure out this situation. And so then because of that, that's your system mastery, is knowing which dice to use when and which tables and which kind of thing. Now, one of the things that happens with that, and one's a benefit and one is sort of a con, okay? One is a pro. So the pro is because all these systems are different, you can remove and replace specific systems, and doing that won't necessarily break the game. So if you try to change the way a mechanic is handled, because everything is based on a D20, there are recurring repercussions that are going to happen way down the line because you decided to change the math behind how a certain thing worked. And that's going to change everything else down the line because they're all dependent on that D20 roll plus modifiers. In this system, you can remove one of them and replace it with something else, and it's not going to break 8 other things when you do that. However, kind of a con of that, the other side of the flip side is that, and especially it happened in this edition, in second edition, because you have all these different subsystems that don't necessarily to some folks look like there's a rhyme or reason how things happen. You can have situations where even in published products, there are different rules written to handle different, like the same situation in different ways. So there will be things talking about like, for example, using strength and how you use that. And some people will say, well, it's based on a saving throw versus this. Whereas other people said, no, it's a percentage roll based on this. And then other people will say, well, no, it's an ability score roll under your strength based on like a, D20 roll under your strength. So things can start to get complicated because you'll have conflicting systems to handle what appears on the surface levels being the same kind of situation, again, written in different published products, and then it starts to get a little bit confusing, and that's where you get like your rules lawyering, right? So rules lawyers have been around since the dawn of the hobby, and if I have one book and you have another, and they're written by 2 different authors, and they're talking about 2 different subjects, but there's a situation that comes up that's essentially the same situation in those 2 different books, and I handle it one way and the other author handles it the other. That happened, more than once. Again, especially because there were so many different supplements and settings, especially like the settings that were being published in second edition, where you had different things, and you had all those like complete handbooks for all the different classes. And in one handbook, one author might say, oh, well, you can use this non-weapon proficiency to do this thing. And then later on, another author might say, oh, well, that situation came up and they played a completely different rule mechanic behind essentially doing the same thing. So I think you kind of get what I'm saying, but that can be a problem when you don't have a unified mechanic if everyone's not talking to everyone else and you don't have a person overseeing everything to make sure that there are no conflicting rules being written in your thing. So that is something that can happen. So I did talk about rules mastery a little bit, and that rules mastery has been around for a while, but again, I talked about in these earlier editions of the game, like, first and second edition and Moldvay BX and original D&D and Beckman and all those kinds of things, system mastery was really being on top of knowing all the different systems and how they worked and which ones to apply to different situations, right? Especially if you came across a rule or somebody asked to do something that's not covered by one of those, where the arguments would start to come from was, a referee would say, oh, well, roll this and it'll work or it won't work. And then a player might say, oh, but like over here, it says I can do this, or like there's this rule that says this. And so that was the system mastery, right? In this version of the game, and everyone passed this, so third, and then especially like 3.5, and then fifth, a little bit less than fourth, but still there. System mastery changes to become manipulating the system that is written, the core mechanic, manipulating that D20 core mechanic for the advantage of the player. That is now kind of what system mastery is. It's not really knowing how the system works, because this one's pretty easy to figure out how it works. The mastery comes from, well, mixing which racial benefits and which racial abilities with which class features, with which feat, with which skills, and combining all that together, which magic item and which spell, so that in the situation, like I get a plus 800 to hit or whatever. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but you kind of get what I'm saying. And that has become system mastery. So it's different. We use the same term, but it's really describing two different things. System mastery over here was really understanding the core behind how these different things interacted with each other, or didn't interact with each other, and how, in some cases you wanted a percentage versus a D6 versus a D20. And system mastery here is all about making sure that your player is the most optimized for certain situations. So that's kind of, a look at these different subsystems. And I would love to hear from folks about your experiences with this. And did you like, if you played these older editions of D&D, did you like that they had these different subsystems, or did you think, like some folks did, that they felt like haphazard and disjointed? Did you prefer when we switched to, or when Wizards of the Coast switched D&D over to the core D20 mechanic from third edition and beyond? Do you prefer that because it's simpler, it's easier to understand, and you want to have a core mechanic? Do you agree with somebody like Rob Kuntz, who thinks that having a core mechanic for a game is, again, like as in his words, sort of putting the cart before the horse? And the ideal situation is figuring out which type of mechanic works best for each individual situation, and that one core mechanic doesn't always want to cover that. So that's a design philosophy. What do you think about that? If you are a player who came in the era of third, fourth, or fifth edition, and you didn't realize that there were all these different subsystems, what does it sound like to you now? Do you think that sounds good, or do you just think it sounds way too complicated, and that you wouldn't want to try it? Or do you want to try it, and if so, why? Like any of that kind of stuff, please, I would love if you just leave it down in the comments and let me know. I love chatting with folks, and I try to answer as many comments as I can. And I think that people here can try to attest to that. I might be behind sometimes, but I do try to catch up when I have time. So while you're down there below leaving a comment, you can also find places where you can join me on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, etc. You'll find links to my blog, and also if you liked the discussion of the dice. And speaking of dice, then we have all these different styles of dice from the game. Well, in my shop, I actually have the patent designs for all these different dice, except this one. I don't have the D6 patent, but I have the patent designs, registered with the United States Patent Office for every single one of these dice, including one where it has all 5 of them. It was a dice game from 1963 that had all these different dice in them. And I had my graphic designer that I work with painstakingly restore all those patent designs, because they're not high res, and did it from scratch but kept the original, design. So it's kind of like tracing, but not quite that. Tracing makes it sound too simple of a process, but recreated all those designs so they're in high-res images, and you can get them on, t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, posters, notebooks, that kind of thing. I kind of like the notebook. It's a fun one that you can use. It's like a spiral bound thing that you can use during your games to take notes and whatnot, show people that you like D&D. I wore designed a shirt that has 3 patent designs on it, the D8, the D20, and I think the D4. I wore it to a party. My friends, my wife went to her friend's party. I went with her, and these people saw me walk in the door with this shirt on, and they said, "Oh, like, are you a math nerd?" Like, and they didn't mean it in a mean way. They're like, "Are you like, is that like a math thing, or are you like a Dungeons and Dragons player?" And I was like, "I am totally not a math nerd. I'm not good at math, but I play D&D." And it was a conversation started, and I started chatting with these people, and they also played D&D, way younger than I am, probably like 10, 15 years younger. And but they were players, and they had kind of fallen out of it, and we had a whole conversation about it just because I had this shirt on. So if you can, it's a great way to support me and the channel by buying something at the shop. Another way that you can support the channel, of course, is by using the super thanks. So that little heart logo or icon with the $ in it next to the video in that nav bar. People have been contributing to that, and it really helps a lot. It helps the channel a ton. And so I appreciate everyone who has done that. But in the past, you see some of the names listed up here, and I'm always so thankful for folks who do that. And there's some who do it on a recurring basis, like for every video, and I'm always very touched by that. So that is going to wrap up this particular video, and I hope you enjoyed it. And again, I would love to hear your thoughts below, and make sure that, again, if you could, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Hit the bell icon for notifications. Share the video with your friends on social media, which is the best way to help me grow my channel. And with that said, in the meantime, I will wish you very happy gaming. Stay safe, and I will talk to you next time. Okay, now for the bonus content, what I was drinking and what I was listening to when I made my notes for this video. So I recorded this video over 2 separate days on Monday and Tuesday. Monday here in the United States was Labor Day. That was yesterday. And I was gone for most of the day, went to my best friend's house, hung out, and let my daughter swim in his pool, stuff like that. But I did come back later that evening and start making some notes. I had recorded part of my video before that. And anyway, I was having some of this. This is Chartreuse. So I thought I would feature this one because one of my subscribers and who watches my videos and made a comment after watching the bonus section at one point, talked about green chartreuse. And I'm sorry, I can't remember who it was now, but this was for you. So mentioned that like this person liked drinking green chartreuse. However, it is served. So this is a liqueur from France, as you see here, and it's 55% alcohol, so a little bit higher for a liqueur. But it's made by Carthusian, I guess, monks in this area near Grenoble. That's how an American would say it. Grenoble. I don't know. Again, I don't speak French. But so it's been made like commercially since 1737, but based on a recipe that dates back to 1605. And it basically says on here, there's like exactly 3 people who know how to make it. 3 monk brothers of this monastery that know how to make this, and they are protected by vows of silence. So, it is a very herbal, kind of a little bit viscous liqueur. And most commonly, as far as cocktails, it would be used in one called The Last Word, which is a really great cocktail, which is an equal parts, 4 equal parts. It is gin, chartreuse, lime juice, and then maraschino liqueur. So it is because of that, because it became popular by during the kind of the craft cocktail movement of, especially again, The Last Word became like a really popular cocktail. It was sort of like one of these lost cocktails that was rediscovered. And then during the pandemic, a lot of people started bartending at home. And so the sales for this like doubled during that time period. And the monks kind of decided, even before that, before what happened in the pandemic, like around 2019, they decided they were going to limit production of green chartreuse, or just chartreuse in general. Limit it back down. And so it's become, they're still making it, they're still distributing it, they're just limiting how much they're doing. So my dad bought this bottle for me. He saw it for sale like maybe last year, and he called me from the store and he's like, they've got 3 bottles. Do you want one? And I said yes. And, already had one at home, but I thought, it's not going to hurt to get another one. So he grabbed it for me, grabbed one for his friend. Now, the monks make 2 different versions. This is the standard. This is chartreuse. And then they make another one called yellow chartreuse. Now, interestingly enough, if you ever had a box of Crayola crayons when you were a kid, if you had like the super fancy box, or maybe your school had it, like, the box is 64, there was a color in there called green chartreuse, or it might have just been called chartreuse. But anyway, that was named after this. So a lot of people think that the liqueur is named after the color. It's the other way around. So the name for that color came from how this looks. I mean, you can just see how green this is in the glass. And then there's also a color called yellow chartreuse now, and that is named after the color of the yellow one. I guess I should have brought the yellow one out just so you can compare, but I'll do that in a future video. Anyway, normally you would drink this like, unless you're going to put it in a cocktail, you would drink it, say, after dinner. Usually maybe on the rocks. Another way you can serve it is like with soda water. Okay. So, but a lot of times this is something that, again, I will have after dinner as like a digestif, and kind of just wanted to share it with you guys, just because, again, it is getting a little bit more difficult to find. It's not going away. It's just, again, limited production. So my advice is, if you're ever out and you see a bottle and it's not ridiculously expensive, I'd say grab it. So my dad got this one for me, and it was probably in the $35 range, which is pretty reasonable for what it is, and given how, the limited production. So cheers, salute, all those things. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is aggressively herbal, I will say that. I quite like it. I think it works very well in a last word, because maraschino liqueur is so sweet, and this really, really helps balance it. So anyway, listening wise, listen to this. This is Nina Simone. I'm going to move that bottle out of the way. This is one of her lesser known records. This is called Baltimore, which is also the lead song off of this record, written by Randy Newman, the song. And Baltimore is first distributed or published in 1978. This is a new pressing by Vinyl Me Please, VMP, but originally released on the CTI label. And what had happened during this time period? So Nina Simone had kind of grown more and more displeased with the Black experience in America during this time period. So, it's post-civil rights, but things still haven't really gotten better. And so she has moved at this point to a lot of different places. She's moving around. But this record's actually going to be recorded, as I recall, in a barn in Belgium. And a lot of the songs on here, she's trying to kind of take advantage of some of the popular songwriters at the time. So again, Baltimore is going to be written by Randy Newman. I think one of these songs down here was written by Judy Collins. And then Rich Girl, if you're wondering, that is the one by Daryl Hall and John Oates. So, which was originally written, I think, in 1976. So she's covering that song here. Very interesting version. But basically, there was just the person who produced and helped arrange this album. There's a real heavy reliance on like orchestration and backup vocals and some strings. There was some weird kind of like, not weird, weird to Nina, kind of like reggae types of musicality in this that she just was not a fan of. So she basically says that she like blew through this recording, got it done as quickly as possible. My understanding is that she went through this and recorded all of these songs in less than an hour, and because she just wanted to get out of there. And The record was one of the first ones of hers that just did not do well commercially. It had some fans among critics, but the reaction was mixed. So just to show you how different the reactions are, All About Jazz gave this a 5 out of 5, but allmusic.com gives it a 2.5 stars out of 5. So very, very different mixed critical reactions. And it's just one of these albums that has just kind of like not been around. So I don't even know if it ever had a repressing until I think the early 2000s. So it went over 20 years, almost 25, I think, without having a repressing. This one here that I have is, it's a really nice pressing. It's on some fancy colored vinyl. I actually have it in my player as we speak. So it's kind of on this like red, ruby red vinyl, I think they called it, which is, it's got a little fancy design on there. I quite like the album, mostly just because I hadn't heard it before. So it was new to me. And I like Nina. I like some of her older stuff quite a bit. And so it was fun for me to listen to something that was a little bit later in her career and listening to these different songs. Her voice is great. So, the choice of material is, fine. These last two songs here are like traditional, like standards. But anyway, I thought it was kind of a fun album. I would recommend looking it up, see if you can find it on your streaming services or whatever. Or, maybe you're crate digging at some point and you come across the original and, somewhere in a bin that's been forgotten. That would be a nice find, I would think. But anyway, yeah, give it a listen. Let me know what you think down in the comments. And if you have some green chartreuse, go ahead and make that cocktail and mention the last word if you can get the ingredients, or just have some neat. And thanks for joining me on this video talking about the, different mechanics that were used in early editions of D&D. I hope you enjoyed this one. It was a lot of fun to put together and go through and kind of come up with the, the 4 different systems and stuff like that. So I hope you dug that. Let me know. Check out some of these other videos here, and I will talk to you next time.